On the 10th of July, 1832, the President of the United States sent a letter to Congress explaining why he would not sign a bill. The bill would have renewed the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. The letter was a veto message, and it ran to several thousand words. It is one of the most consequential documents in American financial history, and almost nobody has read it. What it did was destroy the only institution in the country capable of regulating the supply of money. The consequences were not abstract. Within 5 years, the United States entered a financial collapse that closed hundreds of banks, wiped out the savings of ordinary families, and began a depression that lasted the better part of 6 years. After that came a period of nearly 80 years in which the country had no central bank at all, and endured a banking panic roughly every 15 years as a result. The man who wrote the letter was Andrew Jackson. He believed he was protecting ordinary Americans from a concentration of financial power that had corrupted their government. The striking thing, and the reason this story is worth 40 minutes rather than a paragraph, is that he was substantially right about the problem and catastrophically wrong about the solution. This is the story of how the United States talked itself out of having a central bank, what it cost, and why the argument that produced it has never actually been settled. And there is a detail that makes the decision harder to defend than it first appears, which is that the United States had already run this experiment once, and had already seen how it ended. The Second Bank of the United States was called the Second because there had been a first. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, had pushed a national bank through Congress in 1791 over the objections of Jefferson and Madison, who argued that the Constitution gave no such power. Hamilton's answer was that a government granted the authority to tax, borrow, and regulate commerce must possess the means to do those things, and that a bank was such a means. Washington signed it. The first Bank of the United States was chartered for 20 years, and it worked. It held the government's deposits, moved money between states, lent to the Treasury, and disciplined state banknote issues in exactly the manner its successor later would. In 1811, its charter came up for renewal, and the same objections were made. Unconstitutional, too powerful, too much of its stock in foreign hands. The renewal failed in the House by 1 vote, and in the Senate on the casting vote of the Vice President. The bank closed. Within 18 months, the United States was at war with Britain. What followed is the practical demonstration. Without a national bank, the government struggled to borrow, struggled to move funds to where its armies were, and struggled to pay for anything at scale. State banks multiplied and issued notes freely against reserves they did not hold. By 1814, with British troops in Washington, banks outside New England suspended payment in coin altogether, and the currency of the United States fractured into a patchwork of discounted paper. The war ended in 1815. The Second Bank was chartered in 1816 by a Congress that included men who had voted against renewal 5 years earlier and had changed their minds for the most persuasive reason available. They had watched what happened without one. Madison, who had argued in 1791 that a national bank was unconstitutional, signed the charter himself. So when Jackson vetoed recharter in 1832, he was not making a novel decision about an untested institution. He was making the same decision the country had made in 1811, which it had reversed within 5 years at considerable cost, having learned in the interval precisely what the absence of such a bank meant in an emergency. That is not hindsight, it was living memory. Men in that Congress had been in the previous one. Start with what the bank was, because the name is misleading in 2 directions at once. The Second Bank of the United States was not a government department. It was a private corporation, chartered by Congress in 1816 for a term of 20 years, with a capital of $35 million. Of that capital, 1/5 was subscribed by the federal government, and the government appointed 5 of its 25 directors. The other 4/5 and the other 20 directors were private. So it was a hybrid, a private company holding a public franchise. Nor was it a central bank in the modern sense. It had no mandate to manage employment or inflation. It did not set an interest rate that rippled through the economy. Those ideas did not exist yet. What it did have was a specific and enormously powerful function. And to understand it, you have to understand what money was in the United States in the 1820s. There was no national paper currency. The federal government minted coins, gold and silver, but coins were scarce and heavy and impractical for large transactions. What people actually used was banknotes, pieces of paper issued by individual state-chartered banks, each promising to pay the bearer a stated sum in coin on demand. There were hundreds of such banks, and each issued its own notes. That meant the currency of the United States was not one thing. It was hundreds of things, of varying and uncertain value, and a note issued by a solid bank in Philadelphia might circulate near its face value, while a note from an obscure bank in Ohio traded at a discount of 20 or 30%, if anyone would take it at all. Merchants carried printed guides called banknote reporters, listing hundreds of issuers and the discount applicable to each. Into that system, the second bank introduced a discipline that nothing else could. Because it was the depository of federal funds, it constantly received the notes of state banks paid in as taxes, as customs duties, as land purchases. And it made a policy of presenting those notes back to the issuing banks and demanding payment in coin. That sounds procedural. It was the most powerful monetary lever in the country. A state bank that had issued far more notes than it could redeem would find itself facing a demand it could not meet. So the mere existence of the second bank, quietly collecting notes and presenting them, forced every other bank in the United States toward prudence. Issue too freely, and the bank would call you on it. That is central banking in everything but name, a constraint on the total supply of money exercised by one institution over all the others. And it worked. By the late 1820s, the American currency was more uniform and more reliable than it had ever been. Notes of the second bank itself circulated at face value across the whole country, which no other paper did. The man running it was Nicholas Biddle, president of the bank from 1823. Biddle was a Philadelphian of considerable talent and even more considerable self-regard. He had been a classical scholar, a diplomat, and an editor before he was a banker. He understood the bank's function better than almost anyone alive, and he was probably the most capable financial administrator the United States had yet produced. He was also politically careless in a way that would prove fatal. Biddle believed the bank's usefulness was self-evident. He believed that men of sense, presented with the facts, would see that a stable currency benefited everyone. He was not wrong about the economics. He was wrong about how the argument would be conducted. Because to a great many Americans, the bank did not look like a stabilizing mechanism. It looked like a small group of wealthy men in Philadelphia, holding a charter granted by Congress, with the power to decide which banks lived and which died, and answerable to almost nobody. That perception was not paranoid. It was, in its essentials, accurate. And the man who held it most fiercely was in the White House. Andrew Jackson's hostility to banks was not a policy position. It was closer to a conviction about the nature of money itself, and it had a personal origin. In the 1790s, long before the presidency, Jackson had sold land in Tennessee and accepted in payment the promissory notes of a merchant named David Allison. Allison went bankrupt. Jackson found himself liable for the debt and spent years working his way out of it. The lesson he drew was not that he had been unlucky in a counterparty. It was that paper promises were a species of lie, that real money was gold and silver, that anything else was a device by which clever men extracted value from honest ones. He carried that view into the presidency in 1829, and it shaped everything that followed. It is worth being fair to the position because it is easy to caricature. Jackson's objection was not simply that banks were confusing, it was constitutional and political. He argued that Congress had no authority under the Constitution to charter a bank, a view with respectable support, and one Jefferson and Madison had held before him. He argued that the bank concentrated enormous economic power in private hands, insulated from democratic control, and that this was incompatible with a republic. And he argued that the bank used that power politically, that it lent to congressmen and editors on favorable terms, retained lawyers who happened to be legislators, and thereby purchased the goodwill of the men who were supposed to oversee it. That last charge was true. Biddle did lend to politicians. He did retain influential men. He regarded it as ordinary business practice and as necessary to defend the bank against attack. To Jackson, it was the corruption of the legislature by an unelected financial interest, which is one reasonable description of the same facts. So by 1832, the two men were on a collision course, and it was the bank's supporters who chose the moment. The charter did not expire until 1836. There was no need to raise the question in 1832. But Henry Clay was running for president against Jackson that year, and Clay and Daniel Webster, both of whom had close ties to the bank, believed the issue could be turned against him. Their reasoning was that recharter was popular, that Jackson would not dare veto it in an election year, and that if he did, the veto would destroy him. They persuaded Biddle to apply for renewal 4 years early. It was a catastrophic misjudgment, and it is worth naming it precisely. They turned a technical question about a banking charter into a referendum on whether the president was on the side of ordinary people or of financiers. Congress passed the recharter bill in early July 1832. Jackson vetoed it on the 10th. The veto message is the document that matters, and it is worth quoting the shape of its argument rather than its details. It begins with the constitutional case that Congress cannot charter such a body, and then does something more interesting. It turns to who benefits. Jackson pointed out that a large share of the bank's stock was held by foreigners, chiefly British, and that the profits of an American public franchise were therefore flowing overseas. He pointed out that the bank's advantages fell to those who already held capital. And then came the passage that made the message famous, and which has echoed through American politics ever since, that when the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. Whatever else it was, that was superb politics. Clay had expected the veto to be read as the act of a man defying Congress on behalf of an ideology. It was read instead as a president refusing to renew a privilege for the wealthy. Jackson won the 1832 election decisively. He took the result as a mandate to finish the bank rather than merely to deny it a new charter. And here the story moves from politics into money. The charter still had 4 years to run. Jackson decided not to wait. His instrument was the federal deposits. The government's money, its tax and customs receipts, sat in the bank and constituted a substantial part of its working capital. If those deposits were withdrawn and placed elsewhere, the bank would be crippled long before its charter lapsed. This proved harder than expected. because the law did not clearly give him the power. The statute placed the deposits under the authority of the Secretary of the Treasury, not the President, and required the Secretary to give Congress his reasons if he moved them. Jackson's Treasury Secretary, Louis McLean, would not do it. Jackson moved him to the State Department. His replacement, William Duane, also refused and refused again when pressed. Jackson dismissed him. The third man, Roger Taney, did it. From October 1833, federal receipts went not to the Bank of the United States, but to a selection of state banks, chosen substantially for their political sympathies and known to everyone at the time as the pet banks. The pet banks deserve a moment because the phrase was contemporary and it was not affectionate. There were about 24 at first, rising to nearly 90. The formal criteria were soundness and convenience of location. The practical criterion, widely understood at the time and not much disguised, was political sympathy. A bank whose directors were friendly to the administration had a considerably better claim on federal deposits than one whose directors were not. The irony is exact and worth stating plainly. Jackson's central charge against the second bank was that it used the placement of money to buy political loyalty. His remedy was to take that money and place it, personally and through his Treasury Secretary, according to political loyalty, only now spread across dozens of institutions with no oversight body above them and no obligation to redeem each other's notes. He had not removed the problem of politically directed finance. He had decentralized it and put himself at the center. And the banks that received the deposits behaved exactly as anyone might expect. Handed a large, stable, effectively free deposit base, they lent against it. That is what banks do. There was no longer any institution presenting their notes for coin and asking whether they could cover what they had issued. Two things follow from this that are worth separating. The first is constitutional. A president had removed 2 cabinet officers in order to obtain an action Congress had assigned to their discretion. The Senate censured him for it, the only time a president has been formally censured, and the censure was later expunged when Jackson's allies regained control. The second is monetary, and it is the part that actually mattered to the country. The deposits were now spread across dozens of state banks with no coordinating institution above them, and those banks now held a great deal of federal money on which they could lend. Biddle's response turned a political defeat into an economic emergency. Holding a shrinking deposit base, he began calling in the bank's loans and contracting its credit sharply. His stated reason was prudence. An institution losing its funding must reduce its exposure. His actual reason, which he was incautious enough to put in writing, was pressure. He believed that a sufficient degree of financial distress would force Congress to restore the bank, and that nothing else would. The result, through the winter of 1833 and into 1834, was a sharp contraction. Credit dried up, businesses failed, and delegations of merchants traveled to Washington to plead for relief. Jackson's answer to them was that they should go to Biddle, since Biddle had made the distress. And on this narrow point Jackson was right, and it cost Biddle everything. By deliberately inflicting hardship to make a political argument, he demonstrated exactly the proposition Jackson had been making for years, that one private institution held the power to punish the entire country and would use it. The contraction was reversed within months. The bank's political position never recovered. It is worth following Biddle to the end, because his fall says something about how completely the institution was dismantled. When the federal charter expired in 1836, he obtained a state charter from Pennsylvania and carried on, running what had been the central bank of the United States as an ordinary commercial bank in Philadelphia. Stripped of its federal function and its federal deposits, It was now simply a large bank with a famous name, competing for business like any other. Biddle retired in 1839. The bank failed in 1841, taking with it the savings of a great many people who had trusted the name. In 1842, he was arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy in connection with the bank's affairs. The charges were eventually dismissed on a technical ground rather than a finding of innocence, and he spent his remaining years in civil litigation, his fortune largely gone. He died in 1844 at 58. There is no need to be sentimental about him. He had wielded real power carelessly and had, at the decisive moment, tried to coerce a country by squeezing its credit. But the arc is instructive. The most capable financial administrator in the United States ended as a defendant, and the institution he ran, the one that had made American money work, ended as a failed Philadelphia bank whose collapse cost ordinary depositors their money. Both facts were widely reported, and both were read at the time as vindication of everything Jackson had said. Winning the argument and being right are not the same thing, and this is the case where they came apart most completely. The charter expired in 1836. The institution continued for a few years as a Pennsylvania state bank and failed in 1841, and by then it hardly mattered. The question had been settled. What followed is the part of the story usually left out, and it is the part that establishes the cost. With the bank gone and federal money distributed to state banks, the restraint on note issue disappeared. Those banks now held large deposits and every incentive to lend against them, and there was no longer any institution routinely presenting their notes for redemption in coin. Lending expanded rapidly, and much of it went into land. The federal government was selling enormous quantities of public land in the West, and buyers were paying with banknotes, notes issued by banks that had received their reserves from federal deposits, to buy land from the federal government, which then deposited the proceeds back into the same banks, which lent them out again. That circle is worth pausing on. It is not fraud, every step is legitimate. But the same money was doing several jobs at once, and the total volume of credit was expanding with nothing anchoring it. Jackson, who understood the danger in his own terms, tried to stop it by decree. In July 1836, the Treasury issued the Specie Circular, which required that payment for public land be made in gold or silver rather than paper. The intention was to halt speculation and force the currency back toward hard money. The effect was to create a sudden, enormous demand for coin, drawn from precisely the banks that were least able to supply it. At the precise moment, their liabilities were greatest. Add two further pressures from outside. British banks, facing their own difficulties, raised interest rates and called in American credits. And the price of cotton, the principal American export and the collateral behind a great deal of lending, fell sharply. In May 1837, the banks of New York suspended payment in coin. The rest of the country followed within weeks. The panic of 1837 was not a bad quarter. Hundreds of banks failed. Land values collapsed. Unemployment in the eastern cities reached levels without precedent in American experience, and several states defaulted on their debts, which damaged American credit in London for a generation. The depression that followed ran, with a brief remission, until about 1843. It is one of the longest contractions in American history, and it happened in a country of farmers and small merchants with no unemployment relief of any kind. It is worth being concrete about what that meant, because depression in a 19th century context is easy to read past. There was no deposit insurance. When a bank failed, the money people had placed in it was simply gone, and there was no process by which any part of it came back. There was no unemployment insurance, No public relief beyond local poor law arrangements administered by parishes and towns, with no resources for a crisis of this scale, and no bankruptcy protection worth the name for individuals until a federal act was passed in 1841 and repealed 2 years later. Wages in the eastern cities fell by something in the order of a third. In New York, there were riots over the price of flour. Construction stopped, which mattered because canal and railroad building had been employing tens of thousands of laborers, many of them recent immigrants with no land to fall back on. And the banknote problem returned immediately and viciously. With banks suspending payment in coin, their notes traded at whatever discount the market guessed at, which meant a laborer paid in the notes of a shaky bank had taken a pay cut he could not calculate and could not refuse. Then there is the part that reached beyond America's borders. A great deal of the money behind the canal and railroad boom had come from Britain. British investors, Baring brothers prominent among them, had bought the bonds of American states, which had borrowed heavily to fund internal improvements on the assumption that the projects would pay. When the revenue did not appear, the states could not service the debt. Between 1841 and 1842, 8 states and the territory of Florida defaulted. Some eventually resumed payment. Mississippi, Florida, and a few others repudiated outright, declaring the debts void and refusing to pay at all. The consequence in London was immediate and lasting. American state credit became close to unsellable, and the reputational damage attached itself to the country as a whole rather than to the particular states involved. When the federal government tried to raise a loan abroad in 1842, it could not place it. The Rothschilds are supposed to have told an American agent that the United States could not borrow a dollar, not a dollar. That is a long way downstream from a veto message in 1832, and no honest account would draw a straight line between them. But it is the world the decision helped produce, a country whose money was unreliable, whose banks could not be restrained, and whose credit abroad had been destroyed. What eventually replaced the bank as a home for federal money was not a bank at all. Under the independent treasury system, established in 1840, repealed and re-established in 1846, the government simply held its own funds in its own vaults and dealt only in coin. That solved the narrow problem of federal deposits propping up speculative lending. It solved nothing else. Government money now sat idle in strong rooms rather than circulating, which meant that when the Treasury collected taxes, it drained coin out of the banking system entirely, tightening credit at exactly the wrong moments. The system lasted, with modifications, until the Federal Reserve. So the sequence over these 20 years runs. An institution that regulated the money supply is destroyed on the argument that it is too powerful. Nothing is put in its place. The currency fragments. A mania is financed. The crash arrives. The states default. Foreign credit closes, and the eventual replacement is a strongbox. There is a political footnote here that is more than a footnote. Jackson left office in March 1837, at the end of his second term, having won every fight he picked, and with his chosen successor installed. Martin Van Buren had been his Secretary of State, his Vice President, and the principal architect of the political machine that made the Jacksonian coalition work. Van Buren was inaugurated on the 4th of March. The New York banks suspended payment on the 10th of May. So the man who took the blame for the panic of 1837 was not the man who dismantled the bank, removed the deposits, or issued the specie circular. He inherited all three 10 weeks before the collapse, and then spent a single term presiding over the worst economic conditions the Republic had known. His response was the independent treasury, and it was consistent with everything the movement believed. If banks could not be trusted with public money, the government should hold its own. It was also in the middle of a credit contraction, precisely the wrong instrument, because it withdrew coin from a banking system that was desperate for it. He was beaten heavily in 1840 by a Whig campaign that ran almost entirely on the economy and barely bothered with policy at all. The opposition had learned Jackson's lesson about how these arguments are won. The pattern is worth noticing because it recurs constantly in financial history. The person who dismantles a safeguard is rarely the person in office when the consequence arrives. Jackson's reputation survived intact. He is on the $20 bill, which is either an irony or a joke, depending on how charitable you are feeling about paper money. Van Buren's did not survive at all. That asymmetry is part of why safeguards get dismantled. The benefit of removing a restraint is immediate and attributable. The cost arrives later and lands on somebody else. Assigning blame precisely is not possible and would be dishonest to attempt. The cotton price, British monetary policy, and a genuine speculative mania all contributed, and none of them were Jackson's doing. But the mechanism that might have restrained the credit expansion had been deliberately dismantled 4 years earlier, and the specie circular was a direct act of the administration at the worst possible moment. The bank war did not cause the panic of 1837 by itself. It removed the shock absorber and then struck the wheel. What replaced the bank was not a better system. It was no system. The decades that followed are sometimes called the free banking era, which makes it sound like a considered policy. In practice, it meant that states set their own rules for who could issue money, and those rules varied from strict to essentially absent. In the laxer states, this produced what were known as Wildcat banks, institutions that issued notes freely while placing their redemption offices somewhere deliberately inaccessible, on the theory that a note nobody could present was a note that need never be paid. By the 1850s, there were thousands of distinct banknote issues circulating in the United States, and counterfeiting was so widespread that the banknote reporters listed not only discounts but known forgeries. A merchant in Chicago receiving payment had to know the issuer, the discount, and the likelihood of fraud before he could value what he had been handed. This is the actual, practical cost of having no central authority over money, and it lasted a very long time. The National Banking Acts of the 1860s, passed to finance the Civil War, imposed a uniform national currency at last and taxed state banknotes out of existence. That solved the currency problem. It did not solve the banking problem, because there was still no institution capable of lending to banks in a crisis. So panics continued. 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907. Each followed a recognizable pattern in which sound banks failed simply because they could not convert good assets into cash quickly enough, and there was nobody to lend against those assets. In 1907, the crisis was halted by J.P. Morgan personally, working from his library, coordinating rescues among men he could summon and pressure. It worked. But it made unavoidable the observation that the financial stability of the United States now depended on the judgment and lifespan of one private individual. Morgan was 70 years old. The Federal Reserve Act was signed in December 1913, 77 years after the second bank's charter expired. The country had spent 3/4 of a century relearning, at considerable expense, what the institution it destroyed had been doing. So what should be taken from this? The first thing is that Jackson's critique was not foolish, and treating it as foolish is how the episode gets misremembered. He was objecting to a genuine problem, a private institution with public powers, extremely difficult to hold accountable, whose head lent money to the legislators responsible for overseeing him. Every element of that was true, and Biddle's conduct in 1833 deliberately contracting credit to force a political outcome, proved the central charge more thoroughly than any opponent could have. The question is not whether the concentration of financial power was real. It was. The question is what to do about it, and Jackson's answer was to abolish the institution rather than to reform its governance. That distinction is the whole lesson. The choice was never between a powerful bank and no powerful bank. It was between an accountable one and 100 unaccountable ones, and abolition delivered the second. The second thing is about the shape of the argument, because it has never gone away. Every subsequent American fight over central banking has recycled the 1832 language almost intact. The concentration of power, the unelected officials, the suspicion that a monetary authority serves creditors rather than debtors. The words Jackson used about the rich and the potent are still in circulation, quoted by people who have never read the veto message and would be surprised what else is in it. That persistence is not irrational. It reflects something structurally true. A central bank does hold enormous power. It is deliberately insulated from elections, and that insulation is both the source of its usefulness and a genuine democratic problem. Nobody has ever fully resolved that tension, and the Federal Reserve's independence is argued about in the same terms today. The third is the narrowest and the most practical. Institutions that prevent disasters are almost impossible to defend politically, because their success is invisible. The second bank's achievement was a currency that mostly worked and banks that mostly stayed solvent, outcomes nobody experiences as an achievement, because they are experienced as nothing happening at all. Its costs, by contrast, were vivid and specific. A state bank refused credit, a merchant declined, a rival institution disciplined. Every one of those produced a person with a grievance and a story. So the ledger was always going to look one-sided. The benefits were diffuse and silent. The costs were concentrated and articulate. That asymmetry is not a feature of 1832. It is a permanent feature of any institution whose job is to stop things going wrong. And it is why such institutions are chronically undefended right up until the moment they are missed. Biddle understood the economics and lost anyway, because he never grasped that being correct was not the same as being persuasive, and because when he finally reached for a political weapon, he chose the one that proved his opponent's case. Jackson understood the politics completely and won, and the country then spent 77 years and 4 major panics paying for the victory. There is one last thing worth saying, and it is the reason this episode is not simply a story about a president and a banker. The second bank was never put to a vote of the people. It was created by Congress, defended by lawyers, and destroyed by a veto. But the argument that destroyed it was made directly to voters, in language they understood, about a question they recognized. Who does the money system serve? Biddle answered that question with statistics about note discounts and the uniformity of the currency. Jackson answered it with a sentence about the rich and the potent bending the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Only one of those is an argument you can win an election with, and the country got the monetary system that followed from it. The bank was chartered in 1816 and gone by 1836. It took until 1913 to build a replacement, and the argument that killed it is still running.